Thank you. We tend to think of Alexander Calder as a fun artist, but not perhaps a particularly serious one. Sandy Calder, as he preferred to get called, at one point admitted that he had an enormous fan base, all of it under 6. So it tends to make us think of him as a simple artist, an easy artist, not perhaps a major artist. And I'd like to revise that view because Seattle has just become a major place for the study of Calder's work. It's not that we were poor in Calders. We had this spectacular eagle in the Olympic Sculpture Park, but right now through August 4th, there is a major Calder exhibition at Seattle Art Museum that consists of about 4 dozen works of art that were given to Sam by Kim and John Shirley and their family foundation. The collection was begun by John Shirley and his first wife, Mary, before her passing, and his current wife, Kim, is continuing in this tradition of generosity. We see them there with one of their Calders in their home, Calders that they have generously given to the Seattle Art Museum, to all of us, to the people of this region. Now, Calder liked to say that he wasn't raised, he was framed. Both of his parents were artists, and both of them used him as their model from a very early age. So here we see probably a 3-year-old Sandy posing for his father, the sculptor Alexander Sterling Calder, whose father was the sculptor Alexander Milne Calder. If you know Philadelphia, there is a 30-foot high sculpture of William Penn on the roof, on the pinnacle of City Hall that is the work of Calder's grandfather. So he would become the 3rd Alexander Calder to become a sculptor. But his mother was a painter who was essentially an ash can artist. And her parents, or his parents' friends, Nanette and Alexander Sterling's friends, were Robert Henry and John Sloan, and the artists that have become known as the Ashcan School in New York City around the turn of the 20th century. So theirs was a very artistic household. Wherever they lived, Sandy had his own little studio and whatever materials he wished to make art with, and these are his first surviving sculptures, made at the age of 11 as Christmas presents for his parents. The duck is in fact a kinetic sculpture. It rocks. And they're made of brass, sheet brass that he has molded and cut into these shapes. Well, his father was a pretty major sculptor for this period and was put in charge of the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. So on the right, we see the young Sandy Calder in front of this fountain of energy that was his father's magnum opus for that World's Fair. But as you can see, that's sort of getting to be an old-fashioned looking sort of sculpture in that monumental vein that his grandfather also made works in. And Calder himself wasn't sure he even wanted to be an artist. And so he went to school to become a mechanical engineer. He did his college degree in engineering. And after 4 years, he graduated. He took some odd jobs here and there. He wasn't quite sure what exactly he wanted to do. And then in 1922, he found a job in the boiler room of a steamship that was going from New York to San Francisco. And when he was off the coast of Guatemala, he had slept on deck because it was just stifling below deck. He'd slept in a coil of rope. And when he awoke, he saw the sun rising as a red disk in the sky and the moon setting off of the other side of the ship as a silver coin. And it made an absolutely indelible impression on this young man's mind, this visualization of our solar system, our cosmos, in these two solar disks, one red, one silver. And I want you to remember that as we look at all of Calder's mature work, because in it is his fascination with the universe. And remember, in 1922, we didn't have telescopes that could see what we know of now as the universe. He once said, "I can't see the universe, but I can imagine it." And all of his mobiles are part of that imagination of cosmic forces. Well, after San Francisco, Calder headed north to Washington State. His sister was married to a man who was in the lumber industry. They lived in Gig Harbor. And Calder spent some time at a logging camp, helping with things like all of the pulleys and cables that are used in felling giant trees, and was fascinated with that process. And he did some painting in Washington State. At this time, he was more interested in painting than in sculpture because he was beginning to think that maybe he did need to be an artist. Maybe mechanical engineering wasn't going to hold his attention. And Washington State had an enormous part to play in Calder's formation because there was absolutely no art here whatsoever in 1922. And he found himself, he had lived in New York City, he had lived in a number of places growing up, including Pasadena. His father had tuberculosis, so they had to move to warmer climes. But he found himself drawn back to New York City and to the life of art that he had known his entire existence with his parents. So he went to New York City. He enrolled in the Art Students League. One of his professors was old family friend John Sloan. And he became essentially an ashcan artist for a few years, basically a realist artist, a representational painter, but with a bit of a gritty urban edge. He also was hired by the National Police Gazette to do vignettes, to do little features, and for one of those, they sent him to the circus for a couple of weeks where he sketched all of the acts, and then he produced this feature for the May 1925 Police Gazette, Seeing the Circus with Sandy Calder. And he has all of these funny little things that he remarks, gray matter for the elephant and so forth. But he excelled in those very simple line drawings. And he always loved to draw and paint animals, as indeed those were his first sculptural subjects. And in 1925, he published his first book that he called Animal Sketching. And it's not exactly an instruction book, more of an inspiration book on capturing various animals, birds, dogs and cats, giraffes, elephants and so forth, but with very simple means. He also made his first wood sculpture in 1926, this very flat cat. It's carved from a fence post. So he didn't have a big log. He couldn't make a cat that was not very flat. But it really captures the kind of bonelessness of a relaxed feline. And he was also making figural sculptures in wood in these years, in the early 20s. Now, by this time, 1926, he decides he needs to move to Paris. So he's making what he considered, what the American art world thought of as really avant-garde figural sculpture, like this woman. Very simplified forms. It's partial, cut off below the knees. But compared to what artists in Europe were doing, Calder's work does not look as avant-garde as, say, Brancusi's torso of a young man. So Calder goes to Paris and he immerses himself in the Parisian avant-garde. He becomes a friend of Brancusi, Giacometti, and other sculptors working in Paris at that time. And the work from this period at SAM, and anything with an asterisk is at SAM right now, is this seated woman. So you can see it has a bit of the interest of that moment in artistic history for the so-called primitive, looking at African sculpture and masks and so forth. But it's still a fairly, compared to Brancusi, a fairly conservative sort of figure sculpture. But in the 5 years, years between 1926 and 1931 that Calder spent in Paris, he was working on his circus. So this was a group of objects that Calder created out of junk, out of whatever came to hand, that originally fit in one suitcase, but by the time he left Paris, it took 5 suitcases to house it all, and he would stage performances for his friends. So it was kinetic art. I'll show you a photograph in a moment, but for instance, you can see the trapeze artists hanging in the background, and they flip and twirl. Here is the lion. Can you recognize what the lion's drum is made out of? It is the cage of a champagne cork. He's flattened it a little bit. Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, you can see it. And yet he creates something that is so whimsical, so perfect for this scale of a lion. And you can see that he's using fabric and cork and various materials, and here he is performing. And a major modernist photographer took pictures of Calder performing his circus. So this circus, it was performance art a good 30, 40 years before performance art became a recognized artistic category. And it was a place where Calder mixed his American friends and his new avant-garde friends and created this new sort of art form. He would later, once he moved back to the United States, create a series of drawings based on the circus theme that 30 years after that were turned into lithographs, and there are lithographs of the circus drawings in the Shirley collection at SAM right now. So he's really skilled at these drawings, these line drawings, often playing with taking a single line and seeing how much he can do without lifting his pen off of the paper. And he began to do the same thing with wire. And our cow, the Seattle cow, unfortunately does not have the cow patty, that little coil of wire that the similar cow in MoMA from about a year earlier has. But Calder, choosing to sculpt in wire, is making a really radical choice. We think of sculpture as something weighty, massive, and instead, he's making sculptures that are mostly void, that are, in a way, drawings in space with a single line of wire. And these included subject matter that goes back to the early history of Western art, like this Romulus and Remus that he made in 1927, and it's big, it's 10 feet long. It's not, the cow is little, the cow is a little figurine. This is a, it's, in a way, it's a monumental sculpture. The subject is the subject of the founders of Rome, and the subject of a famous work in the history of art, this Etruscan, we think, wolf, and the babies that were added to it in the Renaissance, but it is handled in an absolutely radical modern way in which we are imagining the body of that wolf from just the contour line of its back. And he also was hired in 1931 to illustrate Aesop's fables, which he did with these line drawings. And this was a luxury production. Each purchaser of the first 25 of these books also got the original Calder drawing for one of the fables. And the one that John Shirley purchased was the original drawing for the dog and the wolf. He was also sculpting portraits in wire, which, although they are necessarily quite abstract, manage to convey a likeness. And he was becoming very close friends with the Catalan artist Joan Miró, but he did mention going to Miró's studio and seeing a thing that was, in his description, it was a postcard and a feather stuck in a cork. It was something like this Spanish dancer that Miró made in 1928. And Calder said, in his mind at that point, it wasn't art. He didn't know what it was. But he became very good friends with Miró. Now, I'm only going to show you this one piece of jewelry, I think, because the jewelry for him was sort of separate from his artistic process. It was either for friends and family members, it was a gift, or it was something that he did when he was in a bind and wanted to make money. And yet it's some of the greatest jewelry of the 20th century. In 1930, Calder visited the studio of Piet Mondrian. And he said he knew about modernism, but that abstraction wasn't a real concrete thing to him until he walked into Mondrian's studio. And not only were there Mondrian's typical grid paintings with primary colors, but everything in the studio was painted white. All of, even the easels, the chairs, everything. And then on the walls where there weren't paintings were rectangles of color, primary colors, that would inspire Mondrian. And Calder was flummoxed. And he went home, and for the next couple of weeks, he did nothing but paint imitation Mondrians, like this one. And then he realized that he was painting imitation Mondrians, that he didn't really have something new to say in this sort of minimalist, rectilinear sort of painting, but that he might have something new to say in sculpture. Now, in 1930, he had been given a show at MoMA. He was in a group show of young American talent. And at that time, American meant figurative. And so he showed things like the cow, his linear animal sculptures, his portraits. But in 1931, he was given a show in Paris, a show that he called Volumes, Vectors, Densities / Drawings, Portraits. And here in this view, we are only seeing sculptures, and you can see that the portraits are hung up high, but that lower, arranged around the edges of the room, are a group of abstract sculptures. So they're still quite linear. Here's one that we can see in the photograph at the very right. It's that one. He calls this crossing, which I believe is the same word for cruise. And it doesn't move. Although 2 of the works in this show were kinetic, most of them were not. But even though that white sphere and that black sphere are fixed in place, we imagine motion. We imagine that as a planet with an equator being orbited by a couple of moons, perhaps. And so that is there in our imagination, but Calder began to design works that actually moved. And his early works that moved were run by motors. So you can sort of imagine this. We can see the gears there at the bottom, and you can imagine these shapes moving in a fairly predictable pattern. But in 1931, he also made his first object that moved only due to air currents. And that's this object with red discs. And so his next show in Paris was going to be largely of these kinetic works, both with motors and without. But he didn't know what to call them as a group. And his friend Marcel Duchamp, who had really introduced motion into modern painting, he suggested, why don't you call them mobiles? And the word mobile in French means both mobile or mobile and motion, motif, motive. So Duchamp invents the word mobile for Calder's works. We've all bought mobiles. Most of us have made mobiles or hung them over the crib of a loved one. They didn't really exist before Calder. This is Calder's work, A Universe. This is one of the last ones that he made that was motorized. And that red ball, the motor is more hidden. It's in the base. And the red ball travels and the white ball travels, and the entire process takes 40 minutes. So it's sort of on a loop. It would repeat every 40 minutes. And apparently when this was shown at MoMA some years later, Albert Einstein sat and watched it for 40 minutes and said, I wish I had thought of that. So it is really the work that most overtly shows us that Calder's work is about the universe, about imagining the universe in wire, in spheres, in that red sun and that silver moon that appeared off of the bow of his ship. In 1934, he made his first work that he intended to be an outdoor sculpture. So this was for his home, and he had moved to Roxbury, Connecticut, a rambling country fixer-upper, and this was to go out in their yard, but it did not stand up to the elements. It kept tilting over in a high wind. Always through Calder, there's this learning process. Some things work, some things don't. But about this time, he ceases to mechanize his work and instead decides that it will simply be moved by the wind, by air currents, by chance, which was a very important principle to Marcel Duchamp and other artists in the Dada art movement. For instance, Jean Arp supposedly created this collage by dropping these pieces of paper onto the paper beneath, although we think he must have had rules because none of them overlap. Nevertheless, he says this is arranged according to the laws of chance. So Calder, in the 1930s, is back in the United States making abstract sculpture and moving American art, which prior to this, and really in the 1930s, think about regionalism, think about the WPA murals that were going up in post offices in these years. They're very much figurative works of art, and Calder is experimenting with abstraction and beginning to make his first hanging mobiles. Of the sort that we think of when the word mobile comes to mind. Ones like Untitled, which is made from found objects, bits of glass, even at the top left, 2 buttons of slightly different diameter. And of course, the shadows on the wall become part of the experience of the work of art. And sometimes he would suspend them in front of his own paintings or other sculptured objects. He calls this one Little Yellow Panel, and it's inspired again by that experience in Mondrian's studio, looking at the colored rectangles and thinking about shape, form, color, abstraction. But here things move. And in fact, he told Mondrian that wouldn't it be interesting to have your works oscillate? And Mondrian objected that his work was already very fast. But you can see here that his shapes are not fixed. They're not just spheres anymore. He's taking on the sort of biomorphic shapes beloved of the surrealists. So this is a hanging sculpture, and the very phrase hanging sculpture really doesn't make sense before Calder. And yet it's not the type we traditionally associate with him. This one is much heavier, it's sheet metal, and it's called Elephant, but it's bright red and yellow and just suggests a tusk. It's a fantasy, imaginative distillation of a bright red elephant. But these sorts of forms are exactly the kinds of shapes that artists like Miro were using in their work, or Tanguy, or even Salvador Dali. In the 30s, Calder began to make fixed objects, larger and larger, and not knowing what to call these, his friend Jean Arp said, well, if the others are mobile, we'll call these stabile, or, stabiles. And so here is a devilfish stabile. Calder doesn't like welding. And so Calder sculptures are bolted together or affixed in ways that do not involve the searing heat of welding with its scars and its melting of parts, which, again, makes us think of this young man in his mechanical engineering program and just figuring out how to join things together, how to make things balance, and so forth. They had been living back in the States since 1931. It was when they wanted to start a family that they moved to Connecticut. And in 1937, Calder made his first trip back to Paris with his whole family, his 2 young daughters and his wife. And his good friend Miro was working on this now lost mural of a reaper in the Spanish Republican Pavilion at the Paris World's Fair of 1937, and asked Calder if he would like to contribute something. And so Calder made a fountain out of mercury. So instead of water, mercury droplets wind their way through this fountain. And you can just see at the far right of the lip of the fountain the word, or the letters E-N, the last letters of Almaden, because it was an homage to the people of Almaden, which had been besieged by General Franco and his troops, but which at that time produced 60% of the world's mercury. So it's not nearly as overtly political a work as Guernica, which, as you can see, hung right behind it in the Spanish Republican Pavilion, but it shows us where Calder's sympathies lay. In the 1930s and 40s, Calder was a point of contact between the French or the Parisian avant-garde, which is not at all entirely French. It involves people like the Dutchman Mondrian, like Brancusi, like Picasso himself, and Miro, both Spanish-born, but the Parisian avant-garde and the New York art world. And he was an artist who was fluent in both languages, both literally speaking both languages, and visually knowing the language of abstraction and that of his parents' generation of American figuration. And when Peggy Guggenheim opened her gallery, Art of This Century, she wore an Yves Tanguy earring in one ear and a Sandy Calder earring in the other to show her absolute impartiality between surrealism and abstraction. But by the late 1930s, Calder was becoming recognized as an important American artist. And so he began to get public commissions or important museum commissions, like this lobster trap and fishtail, which was a site-specific mobile for this stairwell in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the most important modern art museum in the world. Calder also began to craft larger and larger stabiles. like this black beast, envisaging a public abstract sculpture that the public was at this point not ready for. So he's making these things, but there's really not an audience for them yet, although his mobiles were quite popular. So even people that would later, 10 years later, would look at a Jackson Pollock and say, my 6-year-old could do that, were impressed by Calder's mobiles for their delicacy, for their exquisite balance, for their workmanship, for that engineering sensibility that in America has been more prized often than a fine arts sensibility. He sometimes would go back to subject matter of the Western tradition, like Jonah and the whale. The label's not quite right here. It is Jonah and the Whale from circa 1940. It is at SAM, but it's aluminum and wire and paint. But this is something that Michelangelo painted on the Sistine ceiling that Calder is imagining with loops of red wire and little aluminum figures. And that color red would become more and more his signature color. In fact, we now call it Calder red, and it's kind of it's a reddish orange, this brilliant red that he loved to use. But he starts to combine the stabiles and his mobiles so that they stand in one place. This one is almost as tall as I am, but it also has elements that spin, that revolve with the air currents. And you can imagine if you are in a room of Calders, like at SAM right now, that at any given moment, all of the various kinetic elements might be in relation to one another in a way that they will never be again, or that it might take 100 years for them to rotate back to that exact place. And that uniqueness was what he was looking for. During World War II, it was harder to find his materials. And so he went back to found objects, making a series of fish whose scales are just wire and whose color comes from broken glass that he's finding on the street. And Calder was one of those people who could not throw anything away. So he would amass artistic, I'm sure none of you identifies with that at all. He would amass art materials. But just for human scale, this is what that work looks like right now hanging in SAM. And he went back to faces, although not quite portraiture, but giving the semblance of a face that has a mobile element for the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, which is made of a broken reflector. He also, during World War II, when metal was harder to find, went back to sculpting wood and made a series of sculptures that he called constellations that are held together or joined together, in this case with red painted wire. He calls this one Constellation with Red Knife. And again, there's that sense of his fascination with the stars, with the universe, but also Miro was painting constellations in this period. This is a work from what Miro called his Constellations series. And I don't know where he got bronze in 1944, but he was also making, at least designing during the war and maybe casting them later, but he was making objects that fit together without any joining. So this octopus is made of 4 pieces of bronze that you can just pick up. They're not joined together. There's no welding, there are no rivets. It's simply balanced exquisitely. And that's reminiscent of what another friend of his, Isamu Noguchi, was doing at about that exact same time with marble, with stone. So works like Koros are not glued together. This too is made up of multiple, essentially flat marble components that are slotted and balanced together, but they aren't glued. Near the end of the war, he made this bayonets menacing a flower. So again, rarely an overtly political artist, and yet we get the sense here. We get that this is as anti-war as Guernica, with the spiky black forms and then the delicate petal-like forms out at the end of that wire in a mobile way. And of course, during World War II, many dozens of European artists fled fascism in Europe and settled in New York City. And Calder was really kind of the welcoming committee for this community. And was recognized after the war as a major American abstract sculptor, making works like Gamma, which again gives us that cosmic feeling right from the title. And Gamma has 2 constellations, as it were, of flat disc, colored discs, one of which hangs vertically, and the other of which is suspended more horizontally. And so this is the museum's photograph of the work, but I took a couple of photographs of it in the galleries just to give you a sense of how different this work looks from different angles, because you're never going to see all of the components laid out flat, like at the bottom right. They might look flat, but they're not. And you can tell by the fact that the discs aren't round, they're ellipses. But this is the same work from a different angle. And it takes up less room here. It can spread to be 7 feet wide, and yet then it can sort of collapse in on itself, depending on the air currents. And apparently, in the 30s, at a Calder show, you could spin the mobiles. They don't let you do that anymore. And curators say that people wad up their gallery guides and throw them at the Calders to make them move. Do not do that. It's not appreciated by the museum or the Calder Foundation. One of the major works on the show is this bougainvillea, which is the French word for bougainvillea, which he doesn't mean to just reproduce the look of a bougainvillea, but something of the feeling of those gnarled, strong, sturdy vines and their delicate flowers, although the delicate flowers here are white. And again, the shadows form part of the interest. And there's still those fairly biomorphic shapes that sometimes have piercings in them. And he became interested in sound. So think of John Cage's music from the 40s and 50s that is made with unusual instruments, Calder begins to put gongs or other potential sound-making devices in his mobiles. So you can wait a really long time before that red ring hits that brass gong, and I don't think it's going to make a very resounding sound anyway, but it adds another element to the art of sculpture and to the anticipation of the viewer and the appreciation of this object. Calder was always making fun, playful animals like this rat, and scale is really important with Calder. So some of his works are enormous, but some of them are minuscule. This is an inch high. And it's one of my favorite works. There's a whole display case of these tiny Calder sculptures that are some of my favorite works in the show, because in a way they have the same muscularity and balance and almost monumentality as his big works, but they're on this little tiny scale. So he makes tiny objects. He makes medium-sized objects like this performing seal. This is another tiny one, but it's similar in a way to the performing seal. It has the triangular base and the round movable parts. And apparently for his wife's 43rd birthday, he gave her a cigar box, and inside were 7 tiny sculptures. And she took that with her everywhere they traveled. So she would get to Mallorca and open her cigar box and arrange her 7 little Calders on her vanity table and feel at home. And so there are some works of that scale in the show. This one is sort of medium, and he calls it grasshopper, not because it looks like a grasshopper, but it just suggests the boinginess of a grasshopper. So insects were something he was interested in, and he made this major public sculpture for the Museum of Modern Art in 1959 that he called Black Widow, but most people hated it in 1959. This was not what they wanted to see in a park or in front of a building. It was weird, it was abstract, it was black, it seemed unfriendly. The viewing public was not ready for this kind of abstract public art yet. But even in Calder's two-dimensional work from this period, he's sort of making gigantic works, but on paper. So works like this giant yellow anteater are essentially a plan. This is one of a series of lithographs that he made in the 60s. It's essentially a plan for a large-scale public project. And in 1964, he had a retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. So in the atrium were a couple of his big stabiles, and then some mobiles are hanging. You can see there's a very large one up higher, and then smaller works ringing the circular pathway of the Guggenheim. And this exhibition was a tremendous success. It really cemented him as the eminence grise of American sculpture, and led to greater appreciation of not just the mobiles, those were already fan favorites, but the stabiles as well. And he continued, I think this is the largest work in the Shirley bequest. He continues to make these mobiles that are suspended, that are balanced, that have these somewhat biomorphic shapes. This one painted all white and titled Spiderweb. But even though this is the biggest work in the collection, it doesn't feel large, because although it may span nearly 20 feet, it's airy, it's light. So Calder has opened the definition of sculpture to be not 20 feet of massive marble or bronze or wood, but to be light, to be suspended, to be able to move by air currents alone. Now, while he, again, very rarely made political art, this is the exception that proves the rule, that he made this lithograph for, to raise funds for the Red Cross, I believe, during the Vietnam War, that really focuses our attention on the suffering of the Vietnamese people. But it's a rare somber point in the career of Calder. He had designed his first wire birds early in his career. In fact, he had a collector who was at one point a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, who had a Victorian bird cage with all sorts of turrets. But he couldn't keep birds in it because the birds would fly into these, Victorian cupola things and hurt their wings. And Calder said, well, that is he went to the collector's house and saw this fabulous Victorian bird cage empty of birds and said, well, it's terrible to have a bird cage without any birds. So Calder designed birds for that bird cage and continued to make birds. And in the 60s, he was making them out of coffee cans. So you can just read the word cafe on the turquoise-colored tail feather there. There's one of these, I just couldn't get a good image of it. There's one in Sam as well, but it's a delightful work of art. And at the end of the 60s, he began to make works that he called crinklies. So the crinklies have his usual use of riveted together flat sheets of metal, except that he begins to kind of origami those flat sheets of metal and to paint each flat surface a different color. So where you see the yellow, that's a plane of the metal that then bends for the red triangle, and then bends again for the next yellow one, and then twists, and it bends into what here looks like nothing, but there's another flat plane there joining. So it was just a different way for him to work with the same sorts of materials that he had been working with, and again combining a stabile with a mobile effect that is burly enough to stand up to the elements and be an outdoor sculpture. And the one crinkly in the collection is this crinkly crocodile. So it doesn't have any of the mobile parts, but he's again playing with the same motifs that he loved as a child and a young man, now much more abstract and painted in brilliant Mondrian colors, but still evoking a crocodile. Throughout his career, Calder was involved in working for the stage, for creating theater sets, and in this case, the set of a ballet. He worked with Martha Graham, but this was for a ballet called Metabole, and this is a view that I highly recommend when you see the Calder exhibition, which is on the 3rd floor. Go up to the 4th floor and look down onto it so that you can see the mobiles from above and get a little different view of how they are put together and what they look like from a different vantage point. And this is that same mobile in the official Sam photograph of it. Perhaps the most whimsical stabile in the collection is Red Curly Tail from 1969, which looks to me like a friendly dragon. But instead of a head, it spouts those wing-like mobile projections. But it's, 192 inches. It's 15 plus feet high. And so this is a big work. We can just see a bit of it looking down on the curly tail at the right in this photograph. But apparently it's one of the favorites of that under 6 crowd base of Calders when kids come to the museum. By the early 70s, Calder was making more and more large-scale public works that had finally become accepted by, post-pop art America as appealing public art. And this is the eagle that is now in Seattle in its original location in front of a bank in Texas. I think we can all agree it looks much better in front of the Olympics and Puget Sound. And this is his flamingo in Chicago, which is 53 feet high. Did anyone spot the Calder in Barbie? In front of the building that they used as Mattel's headquarters was a bright red Calder that looked quite a bit like this flamingo. It took some doing. This was it was the first work of art commissioned by the General Services Administration under the Federal Percent for Art program, so that when they built that building, a certain percent was set aside for an artwork, and they created this massive flamingo, which you might say doesn't really look like a flamingo, but I challenge you to get out Audubon's flamingo, and there are some parallels. He's looking at Audubon. He's looking at flamingos, and he is transforming them into monumental steel. This untitled mobile was his last major public work for the East Building, the I.M. Pei East Building of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It is so big it is almost immobile, but again gives us a sense of that airiness of his earlier works, of lifting sculpture off the ground and into the air and filling the space with a sense of motion, a sense of gravity and lightness, and with that sense of the universe, of planetary motion. Calder, unfortunately, died in 1976 very suddenly. He was 78 years old, or maybe not quite, and he worked right up until the last day of his life. He was not ill. He just sort of had a heart attack and died. And his work continues to inspire younger artists, including some that we would not think of as in any way Calder-like, like the African-American photographer, painter, collage artist Mickalene Thomas, who did a whole Calder series where she posed models wearing Calder jewelry, with Calder mobiles and Calder rugs and Calder lithographs in the background. So Calder's sense of form, of color, of movement, of play are all still resonating for contemporary artists. One mid-century critic wrote that the two greatest artists of the 20th century, in his view, were Picasso and Calder. And we don't tend to put Calder in quite such lofty company because his work seems like play to us, because his mobiles have been, requisitioned by Mattel to make children's toys that go over cribs. And because we have forgotten or never knew the real seriousness with which he applied himself to craft these works of art and balance and engineering, but also that these were groundbreaking, genre-shaking works of sculpture. He introduces lightness and floating into sculpture. He creates a sculpture that is mostly void, like the universe. And it is that fascination for the cosmos and its principles that animates all of Calder's work. So I hope if you have not seen the Calder exhibition at SAM, that you will see it before August 4th. Although after that point, the works will be absorbed into the permanent collection. They won't all be out at the same time. I hope if you have seen it, you will go back and see it again with fresh eyes. And I hope we all enjoy this gift to the people of the Seattle area of the work of a major sculptor we have perhaps underrated. Thank you. Are there questions? Do we have a, yes, over there. Oh, that is a really interesting question. Do I know if he did his mobiles from the top down or the bottom up? I am not a mechanical engineer. I don't know, but I suspect he did whatever would have been more logical. I really don't know. And it's really important to Calder, and I think that's one of the reasons he didn't like welding, but the handmade was really important to him. He lived in Pasadena when the arts and crafts movement was flourishing. So even though we look at something like this and it doesn't look at all arts and crafts, the handicraft of these works comes out of that love of doing things with your own hands. So he, until he began doing the very large-scale stabiles, he never had an assistant. He made all of these works by himself, and I'm sure by 1970, he had been doing it for so long that he knew exactly what to balance with what and what shape would catch the air currents to make it rotate at the velocity that he'd hoped for and so forth. But I don't know whether he started at the bottom and worked up or started in the middle and worked in both directions. It's a really interesting question. Other questions? Yes. That's another really interesting question. So yes, they do, and they are constructed so they can be taken apart. And at one point when he was living in the US, and Duchamp was arranging for him to have a show in Paris, the shipping charges were just astronomical. And so he figured out ways of disassembling and shipping things essentially flattened, and then having them easily reassembled when they get to where they're going. So yeah, a lot of them can be disassembled. And teaser, my next talk, and I'm not sure the date, will be on two African artists, one of whom is El Anatsui. And when he sends his art, it's really up to the curators to arrange his sort of sculptured textiles on the wall as they see fit, so that they can be, I've even seen Anatsui's hung upside down in one venue from in another venue. So in some places there's a lot of curator latitude, but yes, they can be disassembled, and that was something that he was very deliberate about, minimizing the freight charges for some of these works. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I am not certain. He definitely crossed the Atlantic a lot of times, but I'm not sure if he had a studio in France. I had to take the second volume of his biography back to the library before I finished it. There's really only one biography of Calder. It's Jed Pearl's magnificent biography of Calder, but it's two quite large volumes. So it's possible that he... Mm-hmm. He was well liked. He is a figure in the art world who was well liked. He did not leave a string of discarded mistresses or bad relationships or what have you. Yeah. Yes. So certainly, did he share thoughts? I'm not sure that he did, but and it's not exclusive. But and this isn't a primary color. Calder red is really pretty orange, but that early visit to Mondrian was such a foundational moment. There are these. He talks about these two life-changing moments. One of which was that sunrise, and the other of which was walking into Mondrian's studio. And really beginning to understand in a concrete, bone-deep way, abstraction. And so I think a lot of his favoring of primary colors in something like this, which really is primary colors, which also may have had to do with the ballet, whoever was designing the costumes, whoever was the artistic director of the ballet may have wanted primary colors, but I also think it is an homage to Mondrian and to color and the basic building blocks of color in art. Yeah. His grandfather didn't really live long enough to see him develop. His parents were very, very proud of him. They didn't always understand exactly what he was doing. Something like, to go back to much earlier work, really even something like that versus something like the man cub that we saw his father sculpting, it's very, very different. And so in a lot of the literature, Calder's parents are described as academic artists or conservative artists, and really they were about as avant-garde as American artists got in their generation. They were progressive artists, but that was the generation that then in 1913 got hit with the Armory show. And what they'd thought was, painting a trash can in an alley in New York City didn't look that avant-garde anymore when you are looking at the scandal of the Armory show, which was that. So the Picassos, the Duchamps, the Brancusis, the Matisses in the Armory show all of a sudden made American modern art look really staid. And so there is this sort of generation gap between the generation of Calder's parents and Calder's generation that begins to embrace abstraction, modernism, very new ideas about art making, about positive and negative space, about what a painting or what a sculpture is, and really expanding the definitions of that. So they were a little mystified, but they were very, very proud of him, and they knew his work was important, even if it was not necessarily to their taste. Oh, yes?
Do you know if he worked out some of these three-dimensional design issues with two-dimensional drawings, or is there no record of that?
No, he definitely worked out three-dimensional design issues with two-dimensional drawings. And that one lithograph, well, I can flip forward. That one lithograph, close your eyes if this makes you dizzy, that I showed you is really just such a thing where he's working out. You can see that, like, the dotted lines where something's passing in front of or behind, and where the joins are going to be. And he made when he was making a big work like this, he would make a small scale work, like that tabletop work that the Shirleys were posing with in that portrait in their home, was a maquette for a larger scale work. So he would work it out in 2 dimensions, then he would begin to work it out with, in smaller scale, maybe with metal, maybe with cardboard, and only when he was satisfied that it was going to work, it was going to balance. And I'm not sure even that all of these bits and pieces that look like they're resting on the ground are. Sometimes Calders give you the illusion that there's more on the ground than there is. Sometimes they look like they're only touching in a couple of places, but there's actually something that we don't really see, but it is on the ground. But yeah, he would work, he wouldn't just take the big sheet metal and go for it. He would, he would start with 2 dimensions and then, then work into a model, small scale maquette, and then scale up. Oh, one more question.
How involved was Calder in the fabrication of some of these big items? Would he be in the shop with that people or just hand a bunch of plans and walk away?
So how involved was he in the fabrication of the large pieces? He was pretty involved, although he had particular craftspeople and sculptors that he worked with, and in the case of the, this one, his assistant, who was Matisse's grandson, I think his name was Paul Matisse, had a great deal to do with this one because Calder died before it was finished. So a lot of this one was left in the hands of the assistant, but he was very hands-on. And I don't know with the really, really big ones. I mean, I don't think he's up on a, crane riveting or anything, but he was, as a whole, he was a pretty hands-on artist. So he wouldn't just create the plan and hand it off. He would remain involved in the process. Well, thank you all so much. And I'm just going to check when my next talk is, when you're all still in the room. February 9th, did you say? Sorry? 11th, February 11th, my sister's birthday. I'll be here talking about El Anatsui and Ata Kwame. And you've never heard of them perhaps, but they're really interesting artists.